morning, everyone, and welcome to the League of Women Voters of Marion and Polk County. I thank you for your attendance here at Capitol Manor in their beautiful patio room on the 10th floor, and we look forward to our presentation today. As you can see the topic on the screen, we have our thanks to extend to our longtime member, Sandra Gangle, and she's going to take us a walk through the topics of civil rights laws, and she's going to tell us about what it took to be her career and do her career. We are bidding fond farewell to our member, and I would like to share one highlight, and that highlight you can also see in a photograph on the display is her and Janet Atkins' wonderful work and efforts and sincere heartfelt passion around our transportation plan and our transit district. We learned a lot. It's a document that will be valuable for a long time to come, and one we hope we can continue to take action on. So thank you to Sandra as well as to Janet for those wonderful efforts. So let's hear what Sandra has to say.
Thank you all for coming to this presentation today. I'm very, very happy to see all my league friends and other visitors. I'm sure you will all have some questions for me after my talk, and so I would ask you to hold those until the end, but don't forget them because I will answer whatever questions you have. I'm going to tell you about my life and my career, but in many ways, this is the story of all women of the 20th century. Most of us have benefited gradually in various ways during the century that has passed since the women suffragists won the right to vote in 1920. We have seen legal and social changes that could not have been predicted in our grandmother's time or even our mother's time. Those changes were inspired and accomplished in large part by the women who formed the League of Women Voters after the 19th Amendment was passed. Those women fought hard to change the law, especially the restrictions against women's equality and justice in the workplace. To those women and to all of you who have participated in the fight for women's equality by your membership in the League, I dedicate this presentation. Now first I'm going to let you know what the positions are of the League of Women Voters on which my comments will be premised. The National League has positions on social policy to secure equal rights and equal opportunity for all, to promote social and economic justice for all Americans, and among those, non-discrimination and affirmative action, pay equity, the Equal Rights Amendment passage, equality of opportunity. As you know, we have accomplished A, B, and D, and we have fought hard for C, but we haven't won that yet. And of course, the Oregon League of Women Voters also has positions on women's issues, mainly which adopt the national positions. Before I get into the detail, I thought I would give you kind of an overview of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to tell you about my childhood environment and my family, my neighborhood, my education, and kind of the influence of history on women's options. We're going back into the 19th century and what it was like for women in the workplace. And then I'll tell you about my early involvement in the world of work. Then my high school and college choices, my first career in foreign language teaching and why I chose that career, then my decision to become a lawyer, go to law school, and finally becoming a labor arbitrator and what that involved. And what is a labor arbitrator? All labor agreements contain a negotiated dispute resolution provision. When a grievance arises, it proceeds through negotiation. If it is not resolved, the parties choose a trusted, impartial person as an arbitrator to conduct a hearing and decide the dispute. So I'm going to tell you later about what the parties, what qualities the parties seek in an arbitrator, and why I am honored to have been the second woman in the Pacific Northwest to achieve ongoing acceptability as a labor arbitrator. Okay, my grandmother, Mary McGrath, was the daughter of immigrants from Ireland, Bridget and Michael McGrath. She was born in 1892, the eldest of 10 children. Mary had to quit school at 14 to care for her siblings so her mother could go to work. Her father already worked in the town paper mill. This was East Pepperell, Massachusetts. And the town had a paper mill, as did the mills. There were a number of mills in cities and towns throughout the East Coast. It was known to the Irish immigrants that there were jobs at the East Pepperell Pepper Mill, and my great-grandfather worked there. Well, by the time they had 10 children, they needed additional funds to run the family. So Mary was told that she had to quit school, although she loved going to school, so that her mother could go to work, and so that the other children then would be able to be cared for. And of course, her mother took the same kind of work that her father had been doing for years, but she was a woman. She was paid less than her husband had been paid. 5 years later, Mary had met Frank Powers. She was 19, and they got married in 1911. And she had 4 children, including my mother, before 1920. So, 1920 was when the 19th Amendment was passed. Mary was 28 years old. She was able to vote for the first time. She treasured her right to vote. When I was a child, she always told me, study the candidates and the issues. Vote wisely. Know what's going on in the world. You have a voice. You can choose those who will improve the common good. She believed that the law would change women's lives in the future. She told me that education would be the key to future opportunities for me and for all women. And she said we need to achieve justice for all women. So how did things change because of the right to vote in 1920? What had been their lives back before that time, especially for the immigrant families that came during the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century? Women, for the most part, did not work in the factories. They did piecework at home. And there were very difficult conditions because they had tiny apartments. Sometimes there were 5 or 10 women all working together in one woman's apartment, stitching and sewing and putting together as many articles as they could. And they were paid by the number of articles that they could produce. So they worked long hours at low pay. By the early 20th century, there were women working in factories. There were sweatshops. They were unsafe. There were conditions that were very poor and unacceptable for the safety of women. And again, they worked for low wages and long work hours, as many as 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. There was a women's trade union league that was formed, and the women advocated for improved wages and conditions. But they could not achieve any success because organizing of unions was illegal. Early in the 19th century, union organizing was considered criminal, and organizers were put in jail. By the end of the 19th century, it was no longer considered a crime, but the courts would issue injunctions and would just order the unions to abandon their activities. Because the theory was the employers have the right to contract. It's their property. They can do business the way they want. You just do what they want. And there is no right to organize. There's no right to challenge the employer's right to set the conditions of the wages. So unions were not acceptable. They were outlawed. Well, things changed in 1911. In 1911, there was a fire in a huge sweatshop in New York City called the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. The factory work areas were on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of a skyscraper building in New York City. There were no elevators. The stairs inside were very inadequate, and the fire escapes only went to the 6th floor. Also, the fire trucks in New York City only had ladders that reached the 6th floor. The fire started when somebody had a cigarette and it caught on some oil-soaked material that was scattered on the floor in a dangerous way, and it immediately spread rapidly. The doors were locked to keep the women inside. They were trapped in this fire-filled building. And of course, the fire spread rapidly to all 3 floors. There had been 500 women working there that day. 146 women died, and there were many injuries. This became a public issue. All of a sudden, the public said that we must have some reforms. This cannot continue. Some of the leaders were people whose names later became relevant in the New Deal era of the Roosevelts. For instance, Robert Wagner was a senator. And years later, in 1935, the National Labor Relations Act was named the Wagner Act. It was his proposed legislation. So this public outcry in 1911 grew until the National Labor Relations Act was actually passed by Congress. No longer was union organizing criminal, or could it be outlawed by the use of injunctions. There was a right, there was a national right passed by Congress of employees to organize in unions and to bargain collectively with their employers about wages, hours, and terms and conditions of employment. The National Labor Relations Board was set up as a body to oversee the law, to determine the specific unfair labor practices that would not be allowed, and to, in turn, issue its own orders to employers. You must bargain. When they said, oh no, we're not going to bargain. We've never had to before. Why should we do it now? They said, because the law has changed. Now you do have to bargain. So that's when everything changed, was 1935. As a result, some new opportunities for women came along. As part of the Workmen's Progress Association, I forget what the A stands for. The WPA is what everybody calls it. It was one of the New Deal administration, thank you. One of the New Deal programs put a lot of people to work, and most of them, of course, were men in construction projects and road building and that sort of thing. But there were some projects where women were the major participants. And one was the WPA Artists Corps. And my husband's cousin, Martina Gangle, was one of those artists. And she painted some of the murals in public buildings that were in the Portland area. You've probably seen murals about workers in post offices and other buildings, public buildings throughout the country. Those were done by the WPA Artists Corps, mostly women. There was also a WPA Writers Corps to write works and to get them published. Okay, with the right to organize and bargain, unions spread rapidly in the 1940s. And they didn't just organize, they negotiated. And so labor contracts became very common, especially in the manufacturing industries, where the union representatives and the employers' representatives worked together to come up with an agreement on wages and conditions of employment, such as promotions, promotional opportunities, vacations, benefits, safety rules, time off for lunch, all of these things that now are kind of familiar to people in the workplace did not exist until the unions came along after the NLRA was passed. One of the provisions that is found in about 95% of labor agreements is a dispute resolution provision, or a grievance procedure. And that is the procedure that allows employees or the union itself to file a grievance alleging that the contract has been violated in some particular. In fact, the employer can also file a grievance against the union. In fact, I have a case before me right now that involves an allegation that the union has violated an agreement. But normally, most of the grievances allege that the employer has violated the agreement in some particular. And the grievance procedure usually allows for several steps. The first, to resolve the dispute. The first step would be a meeting between the employee's supervisor and a representative of management, like the Human Resources Department. If they can't resolve it, then it moves up, and one of the higher-ups in the union and one of the management people from the back office of the employer will get together, and they will try to resolve it. And if they can't resolve it, then the contract usually allows for selection of an independent, neutral person who's experienced in labor relations and employment issues to conduct a hearing and to make a decision. And that decision is almost always final and binding. That means there is no appeal. Why did they choose this route? A couple of reasons. One was they felt that the courts were inadequate to handle labor and employment issues. They were just kind of designed for handling business, financial, civil disputes like between husband and wife, family disputes, and of course criminal matters. But most of the judges just didn't know much about the workplace and in factories and what it was like to work in a workroom floor. So early on, it was decided that they would use private arbitrators, usually people who were retired managers who had also come up through the ranks, who knew what it was like to be a new employee and one who had worked his way up into management and then had retired and was considered impartial and respected and knowledgeable about how things are done in a company. And of course, they would all be men. So, and usually they were brought in on a short-term basis. You know, can you come over here tomorrow? We need somebody to conduct a hearing. And the whole purpose was to keep the business going, to prevent strikes, to prevent ongoing disputes and the increase in anger and disputes within a particular workplace. So they wanted to have quick and rapid resolution. Well, the process became a bit heavy as time went on, and they developed more of a formal process because they didn't have enough of these retired people right in the community who could come in on a moment's notice to conduct an emergency hearing. So it became a little bit more formalized. The Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service was organized to process names of parties, people who were experienced in labor relations who could serve as arbitrators on a formal basis. And of course, the hearings then became a little bit more spread out, and arbitrators had to travel more to conduct hearings. And that whole growth has happened over the years since the 40s. One of the arbitrators, though, who achieved a great deal of success and prominence during the 40s was an Oregonian, Wayne Morse. You probably knew that Wayne Morse was a great senator from Oregon, and he was the only senator who stood up and said no to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution regarding the Vietnam War. He had a very strong reputation for independence. As a politician, he couldn't decide what party he wanted to be. At different times during his career, he was an independent, a Republican, and a Democrat. And he also knew a lot about the workplace. He had come up through the ranks working in the mills and in the factories. So he was hired frequently. At the time, he was the dean of the law school at the University of Oregon. And he put his name out there as an arbitrator, and he became very prominent on the West Coast, especially in the dock worker disputes. And he got a lot of cases, and he was very well respected and considered to be a very good arbitrator. Okay, now, meanwhile, we have World War II happening. This was an opportunity for women. The men were off in the war, in the Army and the Navy, the Air Force, and the women were left at home, but work needed to be done, especially in the aircraft industry and in weapons production. And so women were invited into the factories for the first time on a major, in an important basis, and covered by the National Labor Relations Act. And I'm sure you've all seen the image of Rosie the Riveter from the World War II times. Well, Rosie the Riveter was one of those employees in an aircraft factory in World War II. So times were changing. Okay, I want to go back a little bit further even than what I was just talking about, just for a little historic development, the history of the fight for women's voting right. This probably should have been earlier in my talk, but most of you are familiar with that history anyway, but since this is a league event, I wanted to include this. The fight for women's equality began in 1848 with a gathering at Seneca Falls in New York. There were 250 women and 40 men who gathered together to demand equal treatment under law and the women's right to vote. Up to that time, women were considered the property of men, and they didn't have any rights. There were no property rights. There were no inheritance rights. Women were beginning to say it's time to recognize our rights. During that same time period, of course, there was a movement to grant citizenship and rights to black people, especially people from the South who were still slaves, but they were in the North, they were not slaves, and so there was a lot of interest in giving them equality. In fact, one of the men who showed up at the Seneca Falls group was Frederick Douglass, who was a leader of the black movement. So in the beginning, there was some coalescence between the movement to admit blacks into citizenship and the giving the right to vote to women. But that changed as time went on, and the black movement separated off and had its own leaders. So in 1868 to 70, the 14th and 15th Amendments were passed by Congress, and those granted equal citizenship and voting rights to African American men, but all women were still unequal. So the following year, 1869, two women whose names I know you know, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, formed the National Woman Suffrage Association. And they tried hard for 50 years to get the passage of the right to vote for women. They had some strategy issues. There was some dispute among the women as to whether they should include a movement against alcohol, because alcohol was a big problem at the time. And that became kind of a dividing issue for them. And they had difficulty choosing on a strategy that would be effective to get Congress to listen and to make some changes. They tried to do it in a friendly, ladylike way, and it just was not successful. However, in 1913, two women who had been active in England with their approach to women's suffrage in London brought those strategies to America. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. They practiced civil disobedience. They picketed the White House. They organized parades in Washington, D.C. They took whatever public steps they could to demand a constitutional amendment for the right to vote. And so it took 7 years, and many of them served time in prison for criminal activity that was determined. They were determined to be in violation of criminal laws, but they got the attention of the president and Congress, and the 19th Amendment was passed. In the meantime, some states throughout the United States were passing a right to vote for their state, and Oregon was one of those in 1912. Okay, we talked about the war and women going to work in the factories. So what happened after the war? Well, the men came back. They didn't want the women working in the factories anymore. They took over those jobs, and they started the we love you, we will protect you, we will give you nice homes approach to married life. They did not want their wives working anymore. So there were very few women in the workplace after the end of the war. And certainly extremely few women were working as lawyers, doctors, tradeswomen, managers, public servants in government. Those jobs just never opened up to women until much more recent years. Meanwhile, there were inventions of all kinds of appliances and household equipment that would make life easier and happier for women. Washing machines, refrigerators, the television set, and women's fashion were supposed to keep women happy. Well, in 1963, Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique, and she disclosed that women were really not happy with the protection that they were getting and their subservient role to men, because she said it was really just control. And this opened up quite a movement of consciousness approach in the 60s and 70s, where women suddenly realized, oh my goodness, we can do more than we're doing here at home. We've really been kind of trapped here. In 1961, Kennedy established a commission on the status of women with Eleanor Roosevelt as its chair. And the same year that Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique, the commission issued a report documenting discrimination in hiring and promotion of women in America, and made recommendations regarding reforms that should be accomplished. And those included maternity leave and affordable child care. Okay, so what's my story in all of this? I'm not an Oregonian from birth. I was born in Brockton, Massachusetts. What is Brockton like? Brockton is a blue-collar industrial city, and it was a mecca for immigrants in the late 19th century, during the Industrial Revolution, early 20th century, because there were a number of shoe factories established in Brockton. In fact, in the 1920s, Brockton was called the shoe city of the world. And all of the workers lived in 3-decker apartment houses. They were walk-ups, no elevators. Neighborhoods close together, few trees, lots of smokestacks from the factories. People walked to work. We saw men carrying steel lunch boxes, wearing dungarees and overalls, and going to work in the morning and coming home. This was the environment that I grew up in. The women were all at home. The communities tended to be formed based upon the ethnic group that had come in a particular time period. For instance, there were Italian neighborhoods, Irish neighborhoods, Swedish neighborhoods, and Jewish. There was a Jewish neighborhood and a black neighborhood, because there were a few blacks that had come up from the South. And for the most part, there was an attitude of, we will all get along, this is a melting pot, we need to learn to get along. However, there was ethnic conflict between the neighborhoods, and they didn't understand one another very well because they each spoke a language that was only understood by people in their own neighborhoods, and sometimes they didn't communicate well. So I grew up seeing some ethnic conflict. And many of you may have heard who our hometown hero became. Rocky Marciano grew up in Brockton. He was a part of the Italian community. And he learned how to fight as a teenager. And then he learned how to professionally box when he was in the Army in World War II. And when he got out of the Army, he found out he could make some money boxing, and he ended up the heavyweight champion of the world. And I remember when I was 9 years old, the parade in downtown Brockton with him sitting on the back of a Cadillac convertible with the ticker tape confetti coming out of the businesses as he came down Main Street and was celebrated. And it kind of troubled me at the time that our hometown hero had to be a fighter. My mother taught me a lot when I was a young child. My mother was actually a single parent for almost 3 years because my father went off to serve in the Navy when I was just a few months old. And he was in a ship in the Pacific until I was almost 3. During that time period, my mother did a lot of talking with me. She taught me to believe in myself. She said I would go to college someday and that my life would be better than hers, that I would find a way to get out of Brockton and see the world and to have a career. She told me about Amelia Earhart, who had flown an airplane across the Atlantic Ocean. And she said I would be able to do something like that someday. So I had quite an image of what my future might be like from my mother. When my father came back from the Navy, he did not agree with my mother's views. He had a little difficulty bonding with me because I was different than what he had expected. They had another child. My brother Doug was born, but there was marital conflict that gradually increased. And when I was 7 years old, they separated. Well, as a result of getting separated, there were some court proceedings, and my mother brought me to court with her for these hearings about visitation and child support. And in those visits, I saw that all the lawyers were male, and the judges were male. And I had the feeling, even though I was a little girl, that the men were listening to my father more than they were listening to my mother. They thought my mother was naggy. They thought they were sort of critical of my mother's concerns. But my father, they kind of sympathized with. And I thought, this is biased. This isn't fair. There should be women lawyers and judges. And so I had a secret intent from that young age to become a lawyer and a judge myself. Then I had another experience that affected my future life. When I was 11 years old, the family next door to us, which was a Greek family, adopted a young girl who was my age. Tina was a war orphan. Both of her parents had been killed by the Germans in World War II, and she herself had been run over by the tank, but she had survived. And she had a withered arm as a result. When Tina arrived, she spoke no English, of course. She was totally clueless about American culture. She had grown up in a very poverty-stricken agricultural kind of setting. And I became her friend. I taught her some English words all summer, the words for the things that we had in our homes and our yards, and I became her friend then at school as well. And she taught me some Greek as well in return for my teaching her some English. And so Tina had a profound impact on me because I really learned what people go through in other countries, the suffering that they undergo, and how difficult it is to adjust to life in a new country. Okay, I also had the experience as a child of getting into the world of work. First of all, when I was only 5 or 6, I observed some of the strikers and picketers from the shoe factories in downtown Brockton, carrying their signs and saying, "My employer is unfair. We want to bargain for wages," you know. And this impressed me, that they were able to get out there and show what they wanted and ask for better conditions. And then when the contracts were negotiated, I observed that these workers carried little booklets in their coat pockets, and they were very proud to carry around their own little contract. This was their contract that had been negotiated with their employer, and they were proud of that. And this had an impression on me. When I was 10 years old, I had my actual first job. My grandfather had a leather shop where he cut pieces of cowhide, good quality cowhide, for the shoe factories in different shapes and sizes and so forth. And one of the shapes that he cut was a strap about 10 inches long with some holes in it that was used as a belt around boots for Army personnel and police officers. And he could punch out, hundreds, thousands of those and put them in a basket. And he would invite me to come over on a Saturday and to put together packets of those, he called them nose pieces. I don't know why. But so my job was to count groups of a dozen and put 2 little elastic bands around the ends, and then group together dozens of dozens because he needed to fill a particular order. And so I would do this for a couple of hours, and I'd get paid piecework. Okay, then when I was 14, I had a job for an outside employer. Capozzi's Market, which was in my neighborhood, had a little lunch counter, and they hired me to make salads and sandwiches in the morning. And then when the workers came in from the shoe factories at noon, I would serve them the sandwiches and coffee. And so my job was from 7 in the morning until about 1 or 1:30 in the afternoon. A year later, when I was 15, I worked at a fish market, and I took orders and sales. And then when I was 16, I did some serving and short order cooking at a diner. At 17, I worked in retail sales at Coatesville Department Store, where I was a cashier. So I learned how to handle money and responsible cashiering responsibilities. And my best job was when I was 18. I was hired as a summer replacement at the Goddard Clinic, which was a medical clinic with probably 8 or 9 doctors. And my job was to replace the various women administrators, week to week as they went off on vacation. So one week I would do accounts receivable in the business office. The next week I would do accounts payable. Then I would do the reception with the switchboard, punching the phones together. And then I filed medical records in the filing room. So I learned a lot about how the business was run, all the different aspects of a main administrative office, like a clinic. All of these jobs taught me things. What I learned was that there was a take it or leave it attitude about wages. This is the job, this is what you'll be paid. I had no say. You'll be here at this hour, your hours will end at such and such a time. I had no say. And I learned that there were rules that had to be followed. There were policies, practices. And I learned a lot about the structure of business, both from the employee's standpoint and from the employer's standpoint, because I was always very observant of what was going on. So this gave me quite an excellent overview of the workplace for the future. Okay, I graduated from high school in 1960. And at that time, I knew that my career options were limited. Women still were kind of limited to teaching, nursing, office work, and restaurant. There weren't very many options for women. And so most women who went to college became teachers. So I knew that my secret goal of becoming a lawyer was unrealistic, and I just tabled that. I was very fortunate to get a scholarship to the College of New Rochelle, a women's liberal arts college in New York. And I've never regretted going to an all-women's school. What we saw was that the women who were the college president and the deans. They hobnobbed with the men college and deans from Yale and Notre Dame and Harvard and all the big schools, and our leaders were right there beside them. That gave us an image, a role model to follow that I think would not have been possible had I gone to a big school or a mixed male-female school. There were definite benefits to going to an all-women's college at that time. I realized that I had talent in foreign languages. Not only had I had that early experience with Tina, my next door neighbor, the Greek girl, but in high school I studied Latin and French and German, and I thought, well, I'm good at foreign languages, I'll be a teacher. It was a choice. And so that's what I majored in, was French. And then I was hired to teach conversational French in a middle school in Brockton upon graduation. So I went back to Brockton and taught 2 years. Well, things were changing during those years. In 1964, the National Defense Education Act began to apply to foreign languages. Before that time, starting in 1958, the NDEA had appropriated money for teaching students in science and math and other subjects that would build a better technology for America. And it was in response to Sputnik, which had been put up by the Russians in 1958. The NDEA was a bill in Congress that was originally fostered by President Eisenhower. And it was an excellent bill. Unfortunately, it did not survive very long, but it did some very fine things while it was in place. His theory in recommending that law was that through the study of subjects in colleges, we would have a better workforce for the future for peace, and that we would not have a war. He did not want ever for the United States to go back to war after World War II. So from that standpoint, he was a very fine president, and I think he has not been given the recognition that he should be for being such a promoter of peace in the world and equality from a standpoint of education. But one of the things that he recommended was that people be able to talk to each other. And he said, the language teaching that's going on in America is not adequate. Students are learning how to translate, how to memorize and translate. They're not learning how to communicate, to talk. And so he recommended that there be audiolingual teaching that would get over that gap, would encourage teachers to teach the students to be able to converse in the foreign language. So some of that NDEA money was put into audiolingual methods institutes for teachers of the languages that they taught. And I was fortunate to go to 3 of them. My first audiolingual program was at University of Notre Dame in 1964, right after I graduated. And then a year later, I went to France with the University of Oregon, which had a foreign language institute based in Tours, France. So after that program, I realized that I wanted to go back to school and get a master's degree, and I decided to apply to the University of Oregon for my master's degree, and that's what brought me to Oregon. So I had taught 2 years in Brockton by that time, and my mother and I then moved out here to Oregon, and I've been an Oregon resident ever since. While I was Still at the University of Oregon, I was admitted to a third-level institute, also in France, and that one, ironically, was conducted by the University of Massachusetts. So with quite a variety of education, but as a result, I became very fluent in French and was able to handle a very high level of conversation and to teach a very high level of conversational skills to my students. I was hired when I got my master's degree to teach French at Oregon State University, and I was there for 3 years. And then I had gotten married in the meantime and had had a baby, and we moved to Salem, and so I started to teach part-time at Willamette University in French. And then later, when the refugees came from Cambodia and Vietnam in the mid-'70s, I was asked to teach English as a second language at Chemeketa, and I did that for 2 years. So during those years, I raised my 2 children, and I was able to teach even when I was pregnant and raising the toddlers because of changes in the law. There had been, in the meantime, 1964, the Title VII Civil Rights Act included sex. It was a law that was designed to allow equal employment opportunities and rights for black people, but at the last minute, one of the Congress people put in the words, "or because of sex," and that passed. So as a result of that last minute change in the law, which was entitled really as one of the civil rights laws to benefit black people and black and people of color, it also opened up a whole new world of rights in the workplace for women. And among those were requiring that a woman not get fired because she was pregnant. So what were the other advancements that came along during the 1970s? And I think most of us here can remember some of these. Congress outlawed discrimination in housing on the basis of sex. There was a Women's Educational Equity Act passed, which funded non-sexist teaching materials for girls and boys and encouraged educational opportunities for girls and women. There was an Equal Credit Opportunity Act passed that abolished discriminatory bank practices, including the denial of women having sole-owned bank accounts, and also the requirement that a woman applying for credit have a male cosigner. All of these things existed before the 1970s, these prohibitions, these restrictions, and laws were passed that gave women rights. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act was one that I say applied to me, which banned discrimination on the basis of pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical issues. And then, of course, during the 1970s, all of these laws allowed women to realize that there was probably more that they could fight for. And so there was a whole movement of consciousness raising about women's rights. And that led to discussions about workplace sexual harassment, and also to wider enforcement of Title VII by the federal courts. There was also Title IX, that was a famous law that came out that encouraged or that required equality of women in sports in the schools. Up until then, the sports activities were all for boys, and the girls were secondary. Okay, those opportunities were further expanded in the 80s and 90s. In 1984, sex discrimination was outlawed in membership policies of all male organizations. Up until then, the JCs, the Kiwanis, the Rotary, the Lions, they were all male-only organizations. Even the Marion County Bar, when I was first a lawyer, was for men lawyers. And we women were invited to join the Women's Auxiliary, which is the wives of the male lawyers. In 1991, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, and that required accommodations for all persons with disabilities. And this was a huge benefit to men and women, but it just opened up new worlds of rights and opportunities for all people to be in the workplace. In 1994, the Gender Equity in Education Act promoted math and science learning by girls, required counseling for pregnant teens, and prevented sexual harassment. 1994, the Violence Against Women Act funded services for victims of rape and domestic violence, allowed civil rights remedies for gender-related crimes, sensitivity training for police and court officials, and a national 24-hour hotline for battered women. We have seen tremendous benefit from the availability of hotlines of that nature. But it's hard to believe, looking back, that it was 1994 was when those laws were first passed. In 1996, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg held that Virginia Military Institute had to admit women for the first time. This opened the door to women's more additional involvement in the military. Women then later were authorized to actually be in combat positions. And these changes, of course, led to further legal acceptance in more recent years for people of the gay community, LGBT. So the women's rights movement has really opened doors for other groups as well. How did these legal changes affect my life? In 1975, we were living here in Salem, and I was teaching at Willamette or Chemeketa, I forget which. I used to push my kids in a stroller through the campus of Willamette University. And I observed when I was doing that there were more and more women going in and out of the law school. And this intrigued me because it reawakened my earlier dream of becoming a lawyer. And I realized that the reason that there were more and more women entering was because the profession was opening up to women, and the law schools themselves were also opening up to women. Until the 70s, typical law school enrollment was about 95–96% male. And the women who were in law schools were usually the daughters of lawyers themselves who would be able to accommodate them in their firms upon graduation, or judges who just wanted their daughters to have a legal education. There were very few opportunities, if a woman did go to law school, for getting into legal employment once graduating. So for those reasons, not many women went to law school. But in the 70s, that was changing. And I came home one day and told my husband I would like to go to law school. And he was very supportive of me. And I took the LSAT and applied and was accepted at Willamette. In 1977, I entered, and I really enjoyed the law school classes, especially constitutional law and contracts, my first year courses. I gradually gravitated towards the employment and labor relations classes for my electives because I had always been interested in the workplace, as you can tell from my early life experiences. So those were the areas that I emphasized, took every course I could in labor and employment law. I was also interested in land use law. Oregon had passed the land use law in 1973, and it was a very impressive change in land use throughout the country. So, and I was very interested in that, so I emphasized those studies. And then after my first year, the dean, Carlton Snow, who himself was a labor arbitrator, called me into his office and he said, I understand you had the high grade in research and writing last year. Would you like to have a clerkship with me in my labor arbitration practice? This was the door that opened another career for me. So I worked for Carlton Snow while I was in law school. I also had some other clerkships. I clerked for Blair and McDonald, downtown Salem law firm. And I had a clerkship over at the Oregon Employment Relations Board one summer with Mel Cleveland, who is deceased now, but he was the husband of Nina Cleveland, one of our league members. After I passed the bar in 1980, I opened my solo practice in downtown Salem. There were really no jobs available that year. It was a recession in Oregon in 1980, and lawyers were being laid off from state government, and they were certainly not being hired in local offices, local civil offices. And I really wanted to have the freedom to be able to come home and be with my children for their games and practices and all the activities that grade school kids are involved in, because at that time they were 7 and 9 years old in 3rd and 5th grade. I emphasized civil law. I never practiced criminal law at all. But gradually, I took cases in employment discrimination because Title VII was being enforced. And in the meantime, the state of Oregon had implemented its own state employment discrimination laws. There were cases where people were being fired or laid off without a consideration of their rights under the discrimination laws. I was successful in some of those cases. I also had the fortune of becoming a land use hearings officer for the city of Kaiser. Kaiser had just implemented its land use law after its organization as a city in the early 80s. And so they needed a contract hearings officer to hear a couple of cases every month. So my practice was kind of gradually growing in those areas, but I also wrote wills and handled probate estates and land sale contracts and a few divorces, although I really didn't like divorce work ever. Probably for personal reasons from my family. I was in civil law practice by myself for the first 6 years. Then I became a partner in a small firm with Albert Deppenbrock and Mitzi Knockler, and was in that business for 10 years. Meanwhile, in 1981, some changes were happening nationally and statewide that gave women greater acceptability in the judicial arena, the legal arena. Sandra Day O'Connor was appointed as the first woman on the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1982, Betty Roberts was appointed to the Oregon Supreme Court. And during that same year, Norma Paulus, a lawyer, was elected Secretary of State of Oregon. Both of those women later ran for governor of Oregon. So how did I become a labor arbitrator? My clerkship with Professor Snow turned into an internship. And I worked for him part-time even after I opened my civil practice office. I was still doing some research and writing for Carlton Snow. He was a wonderful mentor. He taught me the ethics of arbitration, the procedures of arbitration. He debated with me about deciding cases. When he gave me a project to do, he didn't just take my report and then not say anything. He would debate with me the points that I made and take the other side. What if it were this way? What if it were this way? So he was really educating me for becoming an arbitrator myself. I also had some experience as a hearings officer in disabled student cases through the State Superintendent of Public Instruction. I was appointed to the FMCS roster of arbitrators, the American Arbitration Association roster, and the rosters of employment relations boards in Oregon, Washington, Alaska, Montana, and more recently in California. My first big appointment as an arbitrator was a contract with the United States Postal Service and two of its employee unions, the carriers and the clerks, for cases throughout the Pacific Northwest. And I handled about 250 of those cases between 1985 and 1991, a period of about 6 years. Did a lot of traveling. I went to places like Eagle River, Alaska, Helena, Montana, Port Orchard, Washington. You know, just small towns with post offices where there were disputes. And it was wonderful. It was a wonderful beginning. I also had several case opinions published. When you have a case that's unique, that's new, involves new issues that haven't been written up before, oftentimes the national case reporters will print your decision in that case, and then it becomes a precedent or a model for other arbitrators to follow in similar cases. So it's quite an honor to have cases published. I think I mentioned earlier that arbitrators, in order to become acceptable, need to be impartial and fair, and they need expertise in the subject matter of labor contracts, namely the wages, hours, and terms and conditions of employment. They're called upon to interpret contract language when the language is vague or unclear, or there are disputes over positions in the contract which seems to be incompatible with one another or inconsistent with one another. So this is the way that a lot of the contract language cases come up, where the union has the burden of proof. And then the other area is discipline and discharge, where management has the burden of proof. They have to prove that they had just cause for making the disciplinary decision or for discharging the employee. Two different main categories of cases. An arbitrator needs a good understanding of human nature, needs to be perceptive about the underlying motives of the adversaries, because sometimes they are just plain mad at each other. Needs to listen with empathy. Needs to be able to conduct a respectful hearing, weigh the evidence fairly and appropriately. The formal rules of evidence that apply in court do not apply in arbitration, because the theory is that the arbitrator can weigh the evidence properly and can disregard evidence that's irrelevant. Whereas in court, the theory is that the jury will listen to stuff that's irrelevant and have that affect their decision unfairly. So that's why the rules of evidence are so exclusive. They exclude evidence in court. But in arbitration, no, the arbitrator is trusted to let the parties have their day in court, speak whatever they want, and then the arbitrator can weed through it all and say, well, to herself, well, that's not relevant. I don't have to include that at all. There must be an understanding of workplace culture. a lack of bias toward or against any of the interests of parties, the employers, the supervisors, the unions, or the workers. And we need to be creative in fashioning appropriate remedies for the disputes. Probably the most famous arbitrator is King Solomon in the Bible story. I don't know if any of you remember exactly what the story involves, but there were two women who lived together, and they each had a baby. One of those babies died, and then both women claimed that she was the mother of the other child, the other baby. And they couldn't decide this. I mean, they couldn't resolve it between them. They were fighting over who would have possession, who would have the right of motherhood over that surviving child. Since they couldn't resolve it, and none of their families or anything could help them, they called in King Solomon, who was known as a very just and fair and reasonable leader. So he listened to their stories, and then he said, "All right, bring me my sword, and I will cut the child in half, and each of the mothers will have her half." Well, one of the women said, "Oh, no, 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 please, let the child live. She can have the child." He knew then that she was the child's rightful mother, and he awarded the child to her. Well, that case, or that story has been used over the years to claim, by a lot of people that don't know what arbitrators really do, that arbitrators just split the baby. I've heard that many times. Oh, an arbitrator just splits the baby, because they're quoting the King Solomon story. But that was not the point of the Solomon story. He didn't split the baby. He only used that as a tool, as a way to get to the truth, as a way to determine who the just and rightful mother was. And so he accomplished justice through taking the unusual step of threatening to use his sword. People just have missed the point completely. The real point was that King Solomon was fair and just, and he understood human nature, and he understood that one of the mothers was motivated by love and the other one was motivated by jealousy. And he found a way to determine which one was the one motivated by love. I wish that people had a better way of understanding that. Okay, this is my final slide, and I thought I would raise some questions for you. Have we achieved women's equality yet, in spite of all of these steps that have been taken over the last century? Well, we all know the unequal wage gap remains. Women are at risk, greater risk of poverty worldwide, and in the United States as well. We also know that women fill more low-wage jobs, and they do more unpaid caregiving than men. Women are still victimized by sexual violence. 33% of women are still likely to be abused in the family. I think it's 25% in the workplace. Women are still underrepresented in leadership positions in business and government, and even in the field of education, which is predominantly women as teachers. But the majority of the superintendents and the principals are always men. In Congress, we have made great strides. We used to have 3, 4, 5 women. We now have 19%, but that's still a long way from 50%. We have 4 state governors, including our own, who are women. But 4 out of 50 is not a great percentage. In the labor arbitration field, 20 to 25% of us are now women. The saddest thing for me is to learn that union membership is decreasing rapidly and has been for the last 10 to 20 years. And even those who are still in unions they opt out of membership and just pay fair share fees for their, the work that the union does in representing them in collective bargaining. They say that they don't want the union using its money for social activities or political activities. What they don't realize is the political activities that the unions have been involved in for the last time period since 1935 is what has been helpful in gaining a lot of these, most of these benefits and legal changes over workplace issues. So as a result, many of the legal protections for employees in general and women especially are being threatened. And I think this is something we should all be concerned about for the next few years. So with that, I thank you for your interest in my topic. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I will be happy to take any questions you might have. Okay. And I saw your hand.
Yes, I'm asking about mediation as compared to arbitration.
Just repeat the
Just, oh, okay. Yes, this was Mrs. Churchill, Marion Churchill, thank you, asked about mediation. Mediation is a procedure that has come into popularity over the last 20 years. I was trained as a mediator, and I did mediation for a few years. It's different from arbitration. It's not the same at all. An arbitrator is a judge. An arbitrator conducts a hearing and makes a decision. A mediator does not. A mediator serves as a facilitator, a conciliator, someone who meets with the parties in dispute, listens to their views, listens to their issues, and tries to help them to come together, to help them to reach a resolution that is their resolution. The mediator does not impose a resolution or a dispute on a disputed. Any other questions? No questions? Yes. Okay.
Thank you very much. What do you see as a difference growing up, or people that you've observed, the difference between what has a child question what's going on or a child accept what's going on? I mean, what kind of circumstances, you said it was your grandmother and mother talking to you about independence. Do you think it's part of personality or what? I'm very curious about what, accepting things when I was growing up, this is just the way things are, or questioning or challenging things. I guess it's education and family.
That's a very thoughtful question. The question is, what affects a child more, perhaps? The observations of the way things are, or the words, the instructions, the guidance that's given by others as a child growing up? Or is it a combination of the two? What affects the child? I guess I would say it's definitely a combination. And the child is more likely to accept the way things are if there is not a parent or a grandparent talking to that child and giving that child hope and an alternative to the way things are.
As a child, when I was growing up,
Why don't you stand up?
as a child, when I was growing up, I didn't discuss this with anybody, or anybody didn't, but I had a natural resentment of unfair things that were going on in society. It was something I thought about in my consciousness. And as I grew older and was able to do something about them, I did. But I've always had this feeling of inequity and injustice.
Okay. Thank you, Joan. I think that you've made a good point, that there is an internal internal voice that may speak up and tell you that something is unfair. Oftentimes, I think kids, you do have a very intense sense of justice, but they don't always see justice being practiced, and sometimes they suffer because of that. And I think that's a whole different topic. But I do think that your relationship with your children and your grandchildren has a huge impact on how they deal with the world, because otherwise they are pretty much limited to accepting the control of the way things are, and that's not good. Yes?
Your internship with Professor Snow was a pivotal moment. Do you have one or two other things that you think out of all those that were really pivotal to you?
Well, I really think it's a combination of things. It started, with my observations as a child. Not only did I observe the court proceedings in my parents' separation case, but later as a teenager, I had to testify before a jury in a personal injury case because I had been injured as a passenger in an auto accident case. And so I had a chance to observe the lawyers actually asking me questions and cross-examining me, and then reiterating to the jury what I had said. And I had the feeling that, I can do that. It's no big deal. So yes, observations of the procedures in being accomplished was a big help to me. And I think a lot of women don't have that opportunity to see, to observe what the field actually does. I guess a thought just came to me when my daughter was little. There was a disc out by Marlo Thomas. Many of you probably saw it. Free to be you and me. It was a wonderful thing. It had these songs and dances where children were taught that they were equal. They could both run like the wind. They could both compete. They could both accomplish whatever they set out to accomplish. And I remember discussing that with my daughter, and I told her, you could be a doctor someday. Oh no, Mom, only men are doctors. All the women can be nurses, though. She was correcting me. So that was a teachable moment.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, another one.
Okay, as a decision-impaired person, the last thing on earth I would want to be is a judge. I mean, I could be an arbitrator. I love the fact-finding and the getting people to talk to each other, but making a decision, doesn't that just drive you crazy, or
No.
come naturally to you?
No, it's a challenge. That's my challenge. And I have to look at the burden of proof. And as I mentioned earlier, in a case involving interpretation of contract language, the union has the burden of proving. And that means that they need to convince me by a preponderance of the evidence that the contract means what they think it means and not what management thinks it means. So I have to look at all the evidence, usually some evidence of the contract negotiation procedure that happened a couple years earlier. It might be prior arbitration awards. It might be the way other arbitrators have decided similar cases. All of these things can come to help me in making my determination. In the other kind of case, in a discipline or discharge case, management has the burden of proving just cause. They have to convince me, not by a preponderance, but by clear and convincing evidence that they had just cause to issue this decision. And there, I look at all of the factors. Maybe this is an employee who has been on the job for 20 years, and they did something really stupid, and management says, that is it, you're out. Well, management may have the obligation of giving that employee a second chance. Maybe they need to give that employee some training. Maybe a suspension would have been enough to teach them a lesson. So I have to weigh all of these factors and determine what is a fair resolution of this. First of all, did they prove that the employee did what they say he did? And usually they proved that. But the question is, did that act, whatever it was it bad enough to have that employee fired or disciplined so heavily under these facts, that employee's dedication and long-term job activity? Usually they have a clean record, a good evaluations every year, all of these things that count in their favor. My role is to weigh all of these things, all of these factors, and decide what is a fair result. Should I uphold the discharge? Is it gone? Or should I modify it? Or were they wrong in the first place in even disciplining the person? Did it merit that? Had they allowed other employees to do the same thing without ever getting any discipline for it? And that happens. And so sometimes in those cases, I tell the employer, you're going to have to reinstate the employee with full back pay since that discharge took place. So I don't have a problem coming up with these outcomes. It's a challenge. It takes me time. I have to go through all the evidence and think about it and come up with the proper writing to make it happen. But yes, I love doing that job. Yes?
You aren't limited to what's placed in front of you. You can go search elsewhere and use prior case files like you mentioned, or are you limited to just what they bring you?
I do some research. The question is, how much research can I do outside of the scope of the arbitration itself and what the parties have given me? I can't go out for evidence. I cannot gather any evidence on my own. I have to use the evidence that they presented. But as far as looking at prior arbitration awards in similar cases, that is something that we do. And so, yes, I frequently go down to the Willamette University Law School Library and do some research looking up similar cases. However, even though those cases can be a guidance to me, in no situation is there an exact parallel. You see what I mean? Every workplace situation is different. It's a matter of comparing similar cases rather than considering it a precedent. The only precedent that I would be bound by would be a prior arbitration award between the same two parties under the same circumstances. And usually that doesn't happen for the simple reason that the lawyers themselves say, hey, listen, we already decided this type of case in this case 3 years ago. And so they've already seen that and they've resolved it on that basis. I have seen, one or two cases come to me where they hadn't noticed that there was a prior case between the same parties. But it is very rare. It's usually cases involving other parties under other contracts, and I have to take into consideration the differences before I in any way rely on those other cases. Yes?
If you had more time, would you want to be a judge?
Oh, would I want to be a judge? At this point, no. For one thing, judges have to sit in court and in their chambers 8 hours a day, and they have to be available on call. Also, of course, to be a judge, you need expertise in the criminal area, and I have none. So I could only be a civil judge. And frankly, no, I am happy with my own career. Anything else? Yes, Jan.
Well, I was asked the first year that the education was included in the bargaining process. I think it was 74.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so I was on the team of 4 for the Salem Public Schools. And that was quite an experience. And we went to the governor's office the night before school was supposed to start. And we were supposed to come up with a contract. But I I would really recommend, if you have an opportunity to serve on a negotiating team, take it. It's quite an education.
Okay, Jan has just articulated that she was on the negotiating team for the Salem-Keizer School District in their first contract negotiation back in the early 70s. One thing I didn't mention is that the National Labor Relations Act was applied to private sector employees, manufacturing and so forth, whereas each of the states has a separate public sector collective bargaining act. And not all states have them. Now, Oregon was an early one, where our legislature agreed upon a collective bargaining act that applied to all public employees in the state. And so the teachers came under that, and their first contract then was negotiated in 1974, as Jan said. And it was not a peaceful negotiation.
No.
It was very contentious. And the teachers were threatening to strike. And it was midnight the night before, and Jan just disclosed that she remembers going down to the governor's office and having the governor intervene and try to settle it. But the governor does not have the power to say this is the way it's going to be. All the governor can say is, hey, come on, guys, try to reach an agreement because you don't want to go on strike tomorrow morning. And so this is the kind of pressure which is put on at the last minute in negotiations, is to encourage people to reach an agreement, even if it's not the agreement that they had hoped they could reach, because it's better to reach an agreement than it is to go on strike. Strikes hurt everyone. They hurt the employees, they hurt the public, they hurt the employers in the public sector, that is. And in the private sector, it's not the public, but it's the employees and the union and the managers. So the goal of all of this, the whole process of collective bargaining and negotiation, is to avoid strikes. And in that case, after that midnight visit with the governor, they did reach an agreement, and they had to notify all the teachers, we've reached an agreement, so no strike in the morning. And they went to work. Any other questions? Yes, Rose.
With your life experience and what you've shared about your professional interest in language and communication, and then in the legal profession and arbitration, and your experience with the League of Women Voters, this is probably an unfair question, but I would be interested in any wisdom you have about what the League should be doing in today's political mess. I mean, I think we're in a terrible place in our society, and I don't know if you're willing to respond, but especially before we lose you off to Washington, it would be nice to get any insights you have about what a group of women in the League of Women Voters could be doing, should be doing, what the prospects are for democracy in this country.
Okay, the question is, do I have any recommendations for the League and for women in general, I guess, about how to deal with the present disputes that are going on nationally in the political arena. Certainly the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization that I believe in, and I believe that you have great strength and opportunity to have a voice, and I hope that you will continue to raise that voice in support of the same positions, the same goals of equality and justice that you always have had. I guess the one thing that I would like to see is more involvement in the League of women who are from various organizations, from various groups within society, various political and religious thought processes, because these things have, these issues have such an impact on the political scene that we need to talk to one another to try to resolve things before they get to Congress, to try to resolve what is our common view of certain issues. And that means we need to talk to each other. And I think that the League is a very good vehicle for conducting dialogues and trying to bring organizations together. I know that there is a tendency to support progressive issues, but that tends to turn off people who are not progressives. I think you need to listen to the non-progressives more, and they need to listen to you. So dialogue is really key to accomplishing that. But the history is there. I certainly believe that the League should thrive into the future and should continue to have a voice, and I certainly hope that that will happen. Anything else? I thank you for your questions, and thank you for coming. It's been a pleasure.
We'd all like to wish Sandra a happy, productive, encouraged, active life in the League as she joins in Washington, and I hope that Washington and Oregon continue to have many of their conferences together. We're finding a lot of power in the Northwest joining in on things. So thank you, Sandra, very much. I'd also like to thank CCTV for the support that they continue to provide for helping our voice get to the public. And again, keep in mind about those volunteer opportunities. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.